Okay, now we're in business. Good morning or good evening. Welcome to Economics 330. Today is Global Trade and Political Economy, City University of New York, Medgar Evers College. Today is February 27th, 2024. Our 5 minutes of grace has now elapsed and our lecture time has begun. As you know, as I communicated last week, during this module, which is beginning yesterday, Monday, we will begin a three-part, 3-week study of the 3 theoretical perspectives of global trade. A lot of threes there. So it's a 3-part, 3-week study of the 3 theoretical perspectives of global trade. These include the liberal perspective, the realistic perspective, and historical materialism. This week, we will begin with the liberal perspective. So when we say global trade, there are theories that undergird how nations approach trade and how those theories impact how trade disputes are arbitrated. This week, as I said, we will begin with the liberal perspective. So let's get a working idea of what the liberal perspective is. So the liberal perspective is not without distinctions. And here comes another 3. The liberal perspective is not without distinction. So for instance, liberal economists emphasize the importance of the free market and private property, and they seek to limit the government's role in economic affairs. Of note, liberalism is the most influential perspective in international political economy. Although some liberal economists favor as little government involvement as possible, others believe that some government intervention is necessary for the effective functioning of markets. Simply put, liberal internationalism is a foreign policy doctrine that supports international institutions. 2, open markets. 3, cooperative security. And 4, liberal democracy. Notably, and here comes the other 3, the 3 types of liberal theory of international political economy includes orthodox, interventionist or liberal, and institutional liberalism. Was there a question there?
No, sorry, I was just reading something and I see that what you're talking about, I'm looking in the book and I see, so I repeat it. Sorry, let me put the mic off.
Okay, no worries. So let's deep dive ever so slightly the definitions of these perspectives. So orthodox liberals believe in negative freedom. That is, the market should not be given complete, the market should be given complete freedom to function. So to underscore again, orthodox branch of the liberal order believe in negative freedom. So I think it was Isaiah Berlin that coined the distinction between negative and positive liberty. So you can see the interconnection between freedom and liberty in this instance. But the orthodox wing of the liberal order believes in negative freedom. That is, that markets should be given complete freedom to function. On the contrary, the interventionist and institutional liberals do not believe in negative freedom. They take the view that markets should not be given complete freedom. And this leads us to one of those phrases that I try to introduce, and there are going to be 2 of those this week, and that I try to introduce in every class that I think you might want to write down, work it into your vocabulary, and again, they have very powerful signaling value. So that phrase is laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a doctrine opposing governmental interference in economic affairs beyond the minimum necessary for the maintenance of peace and prosperity.
Didn't Adam Smith came up with that concept of laissez-faire, which means no government regulation of business?
Yes, yes, it is, and it's actually a French word. To be fair, it's a French word that he helped popularize in the English side of
Oh,
Anglophone side of the
okay.
spectrum. So it's French for leave alone.
Okay.
So it means just leave it alone. Um, if you'll be kind enough to ask me about this when the formal lecture side is over, I'd like to just take about a minute to unpack it a little bit. To again, I've mentioned once the importance of dialectical thinking, where we think through the issue from all sides, right? And we're going to just unpack this at the end of lecture for just a minute or less. But just bear in mind that there is a doctrine out there that is laissez-faire, that means leave alone, let the markets take care of itself, that people who run industries are rational actors that will always act in the best interest of their organization. We now know, especially from the market crisis, financial crisis in the late 2000s, that that's not always the case. But again, that's a conversation. I don't want us to get too sidetracked. The second perspective is interventionist, or the liberals, or the liberal perspective. Interventionists believe that strong international institutions like the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, of course, is the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the United Nations should interfere in the function of the markets so that equality and justice can be ensured. That's one perspective. And again, it is debatable to what extent they are effective in reaching this lofty goal, but it is a perspective. Another way to think of it is that if we didn't have these institutions, we'll have to create them, because we do need a level of equality and justice in the system. The third is institutional liberalism. They believe that government involvement should be there in the function of the markets to ensure equity and justice. So they don't believe in laissez-faire. They believe that government should be there, should be involved in the markets to ensure equity and justice. So by understanding these three perspectives, we are able to appreciate the sources of conflict within and among nations regarding trade policies. So you can see the inherent conflict if even within the liberal order, there are the orthodox believers who subscribe to the idea that markets should be left alone, that markets are self-correcting. So what that means in a nutshell is that if nobody ever opened a business and intentionally wants to run it to the ground, and that markets will do the things that are best in the best interests of the market, and the idea of that customers and consumers are an integral part of the market, and that businesses recognize that they must also act in a way that do not undermine their customers, otherwise they will lose markets. Again, if businesses always operated as rational entities, the orthodox idea of thinking, in my opinion, would have more currency. In reality, businesses do not always operate rationally because there are other pressures and other forces. For instance, if you're a listed company, every quarter or 3 months, you have to give an earnings statement. If you're a publicly held company, you have to give an earnings statement. And then you forecast or foreshadow what you believe your market conditions are going to be, at least for the next quarter. These can impact market valuation, that is the price of your shares. And those have broader consequences for your business and industry. So oftentimes, businesses may not have the luxury, or at least executives who run businesses may not always consider that they have the luxury to make optimal decisions, focusing instead on decisions that would shore up the shareholder value, at least in the short term. That is an argument to be considered. But furthermore, liberalism revolves around three interrelated principles. One, rejection of power politics as the only possible outcome of international relations. It questions security and welfare principles of realism. So realists really engage in power politics. If you wanted to see a clear example of that, you could, for instance, no matter what side of where you fall on that side of the issue, if you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that would be what seemed to be on its face an international relations decision that is based on the realism perspective. So the other value around liberalism is mutual benefit and international cooperation. So instead of power politics, you try to find common grounds and try to cooperate to achieve those common grounds. Three, the role of international organizations and non-governmental actors in shaping state preferences and policies. So what that means, very simply, is that there is a role for international institutions, right? And not just individuals, and not just who has the bigger force or who has the bigger army. There is a place for norms of behavior. There is a place for shared values. So the liberal perspective emphasizes these three factors that encourage more cooperation and less conflict. One, international institutions such as the United Nations, which provide a forum to resolve disputes in nonviolent ways. So this is really important. So if you believe in the liberal order, this is why you have institutions, right? So again, going back to the example that I gave about the Ukraine war, you can look at United Nations as a medium where peace can be negotiated. Again, the United Nations can also be mired in gridlock. For instance, there are two major institutions within the United Nations as the Security Council, which has 5 permanent members. The Security Council is the highest rules-making body, decision-making body in the United Nations, and it has 5 permanent members: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. Each of these 5 members can veto a resolution. So for any resolution to pass the General Assembly, each of these 5 members must agree to it, or at least agree not to vote against it. There is the other body called the General Assembly, where all the members of the United Nations have the same vote, 1. And while the General Assembly doesn't carry executive authority, their resolutions can convey legitimacy or convey illegitimacy to actors and actions. Quite often, the Security Council can fall into 2 separate cleavages. Democratic nations, United States, UK, France among them, and the axis of autocracy, China and Russia among them. And they can sometimes, this tension or geopolitical tension can sometimes grind activities to a halt at the Security Council. I say this to acknowledge, remember I said that real education is the ability to think dialectically and think through the issues from all sides. So while I acknowledge that international institutions are critical and indeed invaluable to maintain an international order, it is also true that there are challenges within those institutions that can sometimes undermine their optimal performance. The second is international trade. That is, liberal perspective promotes international trade because when all things being equal, when countries' economies are interconnected through trade, they are less likely to go to war with each other. So again, trade can become a medium that fosters peace and nonviolent resolution of disputes. It is not a perfect system. As one example, up until Russia's invasion of Ukraine, just because, and I bring that up if only because it's an issue that continues to reverberate through the international order. Up until Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the successive German governments took the position that closer trade with Russia, in particular, closer integration of German and the broader European energy market with Russia's supply of gas will moderate Russia's behavior and reduce the likelihood that the European Union countries would ever go to war with Russia because both countries depend on each other. There's an interdependency that occurs beyond interconnectedness through trade. Russia, the argument goes something like this. Russia would not be inclined to go to war with Europe because Europe is its biggest gas customer of natural gas, which is one of Russia's major exports. And on the other hand, Europe will have no interest in going to war with Russia because it wouldn't want to disrupt the markets of its largest gas exporter. This theory has proven to be not very rock solid. As history would have it, Russia assumed that because it had a near monopoly on the supply of natural gas to Europe, European Union countries, especially the largest economy in Germany, that it could indeed, rather than cooperate with European Union, that Russia could hold them to ransom because they'll be so afraid that if Russia disrupts gas supply to the EU, that it could lead to economic decline for the EU because gas powers electricity, which is necessary for industrialization, and electricity that powers the economies of European countries, and that this could lead to social tension and lead to inflation. And therefore, Russia's calculation appeared to have been that it could march into Ukraine, and the European Union, much as they would like to protest, will be less inclined to do so because it wouldn't want to disrupt the market. On the other hand, European Union member states faced a rude awakening that closer trade ties with Russia did not seem to have moderated Russia's belief and in realism. So this again, and I point this out not to argue, I point this out even as I agree that trade makes conflict less likely. Even as I acknowledge that, I'd like to also point out, I'm merely pointing out that it's not foolproof, that countries can still miscalculate, as Russia appeared to have done in this case. The third is the spread of democracy. As well-established democracies do not go to war, rarely go to war with each other. As such, the logic is that if there are more democracies, interstate wars will be less frequent. Here is really the reason why democracies rarely go to war against each other. I suspect that if you are going back again to the Russian Ukraine analogy, I suspect that if you did a polling of the Russian public and asked them if they would want their country to go to war with Ukraine, that perhaps the majority of the country would say no. That would suggest that had Russia been a true democracy, especially as President Putin is about to face re-election, he would have been less inclined to invade Ukraine simply because it will make him unpopular during the next polls. So the argument, therefore, is that democracies are less likely to go to war because the elected politicians are will listen to will listen to public opinion and act in public opinion when necessary and when possible. So liberals believe, in summary, liberals believe that the international institutions play a key role in cooperation among states via interdependence. Of note, there are three main components of interdependence. These include economic, 2, financial, 3, cultural means. So when you think about interdependencies through the liberal order, these interdependencies can come in an economic sense, it can come in a financial sense, and it can come in a cultural sense, which is also what is called soft power, the cultural aspect of it. Significantly, in the liberal perspective, security tends not to be the primary goal in state-to-state interactions, and military forces are not typically used. Rather, liberalism argues that international diplomacy can be a very effective way to get states to interact with each other honestly and support nonviolent solutions to problems. With the proper institutions and diplomacy, liberalism takes the view that states can work together to maximize prosperity and minimize conflict. Lastly, let me quickly touch on another phrase that you may have come across as you are been going through your readings within the last 2 weeks. This phrase is the Washington Consensus. And again, it is one of those key phrases that you want to work into your vocabulary. Um, it shows a technical understanding. It signals a technical understanding of the issue and really separates you from the casual observer. So in a nutshell, the Washington Consensus is a set of macroeconomic policies supported by leaders of intergovernmental organizations, multinational companies, donor states, and economists. And these were really popular in the 80s, and they include, so again, these are a set of macroeconomic policies that Western governments prescribe to mostly developing countries and mostly in the global south. And it's called the Washington Consensus because of the international institutions and other institutions that really exert undue influence in the international order, be it the IMF, be it the World Bank, be it the World Trade Organization, be it Capitol Hill, be it the White House, and other executive agencies that really exert a lot of influence in international order. They pretty much, there is near unanimity, at least there used to be, especially in the 80s, on what was called the Washington Consensus. So there was a consensus among all these Washington institutions on what they call sound money. So one of the few principles include fiscal discipline. That is, a government maintain a reasonably balanced budget. What that means in simple speak is that your revenue can offset your expenditure, that you're not borrowing money to support your budget, up to a reasonable point. Public spending focused at economic return. That is, when government spend money, there is an expectation that that money that the government is spending is an investment that should yield results in the near future, or at least down the road. And this kind of spending include education, because you want to have an educated and skilled labor force. It also includes healthcare, because you want to have a healthy society. And it includes infrastructure, because you need infrastructure to increase productivity, whether it's basic infrastructure such as roads, bridges, schools, the internet, telephones, that will create efficiencies in the economic system. Crucially, it does not include defense spending or subsidies. Remember, weeks ago we talked about subsidies, and when we talked about comparative advantage, where countries that don't have comparative advantage will still produce a widget, but they will need to subsidize it. And often subsidies can be throwing good money after bad. Again, we can deep dive the issue of subsidies in our Q&A. And the third is low taxes, low tax rates. The argument in this case is that if you have low tax, especially corporate tax rates, if you have corporate tax rates, that it would, all things being equal, it will induce businesses to come relocate to your country. Again, that is true up to a point, and we can deep dive those two in the Q&A. The fourth is the money supply that is controlled by professionals, not politicians. As you know, the critical role of every central bank and the Treasury Department of that country is to print money. And the central bank controls the monetary policy, that is interest rate, and the Treasury, in addition to the presidency, controls the fiscal policy, tax, um, tax laws. This can influence money supply and therefore inflation and the valuation of the national currency. The fifth is exchange rates driven by markets. All things being equal, you will want markets to determine your exchange rates. For a number of reasons, many developing countries operate a system of pegged currency that is pegged to the United States dollar. And that is only because it creates stability, as most globally traded commodities are priced in US dollars. The sixth is open markets to trade and investments. So the Washington Consensus will encourage countries to open their markets to trade and investment. This is also true up to a point. What no country would want to be is a consumer nation. A country wants to produce, wants to be able to produce. And if you're in the global south, you're getting into the global international system on the back foot, because you almost always don't have the efficiencies and the technological prowess of the global north. So you would need, quite often these countries would argue, a level of protectionism to help nurture your domestic markets, and then as they mature, you break down the trade barriers. At least that is a school of thought, again, that I present because it's out there. And the seventh is to deregulate economy and privatize national industries. This is true up to a point, and I think we've had the conversation on the challenges of privatizing national industries and deregulating markets. Just in a nutshell, the major challenge with this is that underdeveloped economies often have weak institutions, and it can be a little sometimes unrealistic to expect these weak institutions to somehow be able to step up to the deregulatory challenges, the challenges that come from a deregulated market, and then to also efficiently and without corruption privatize national institutions. This can be a little bit much, and then be able to collect taxes from this company, from these industries that have now been privatized. On the other hand, governments do not have a good track record of running industries. So that's another way to look at it. So again, this is looking at the issue from all perspectives. The last is protection of property rights. The Washington Consensus would require and promote the protection of property rights. This can be intellectual property, and this can be physical property of institutions. And this is generally what the Washington Consensus refers to. So when you hear that come up in a conversation, you would be able to contribute to that conversation in a technical way, having a solid ground and an understanding of what some of the key requirements are, and again, understanding that some of those come with caveats. So this concludes the formal section of this week's lecture. I would also say that you please note that next week we will cover the realistic perspective in international political economy. And with that, I will end the recording and we will transition into Q&A. Thank you very much.